I often refer to what I believe is a wrong and potentially dangerous doctrine called replacement theology. I refer to it as replacement theology, or its more technical term, supersessionism. What does it mean? It means that people believe that the church has replaced Israel in God's plan of salvation, or superseded Israel in God's plan of salvation. But folks who believe this say to me, we don't believe it. We don't believe the way you're representing it. You're misrepresenting it. You're misunderstanding our position. We believe in fulfillment theology, not replacement theology, that all the promises to Israel are fulfilled in Jesus, so whoever is in Jesus, Jew or Gentile, they're recipients of the promise. Or we believe in expansion theology, that God has expanded the commonwealth of Israel. And in fact, when I had a friendly debate with Gary DeMar about some related issues, he pointed out the use of ecclesia, the Greek word ecclesia, which is used in the New Testament a couple of times by Jesus in Matthew 16:18, normally translated church, but better translated congregation or messianic community, that's now used in the book of Acts repeatedly in the epistles, the ecclesia, the church, the messianic community, the congregation. And that's the same word that's used for Old Testament Israel. So this is just a continuation of the people of God, and it's always been the people of faith, and now unbelieving Jews drop out and believing Gentiles join in, so nothing is being replaced. I appreciate those arguments, and I certainly understand those arguments, but let me explain why it's right to call it replacement theology, all right? And then I'll answer the question, has the church replaced Israel? Here's why it's right to call it replacement theology. There are promises that God gave to the physical descendants of Israel in the Old Testament, all right? And even Israel in its unbelief was preserved by God. And he said, I will scatter you in my wrath, but I will regather you in my mercy. If he regathers someone other than he scattered, then they have been replaced. If he says to the Jewish people, I will scatter you, physical Jews, descendants of Israel, in my anger, and regather you in my mercy, and the regathering is a spiritual gathering of Gentiles and Jews who believe in Jesus, then those recipients, the original recipients, have been replaced. If God says in Ezekiel 36 about the Babylonian captivity and the end-time captivity, he says there that as he scattered his people Israel, he will bring them back. Who? Physical descendants of Israel, Jewish people. Even in their unbelief, he'll bring them back to the land. If it now refers to somebody else, then they have been replaced. It is replacement theology. It's just another way of saying it. Whether it's fulfillment or expansion, if the original recipients of the promise are not the recipients of the promise today, then they have been replaced. And it is therefore replacement theology. And that's what Paul warns against in Romans 11. To the Gentile branches, don't be arrogant. Don't think the natural branches were cut off, the Jewish branches, so the Gentile branches could be grafted in as if the Gentiles are any better. No, you stand by faith and you can be cut off too. And God will ultimately graft the Jews back into that tree. In other words, there is a promise of salvation, national salvation for ethnic Israel. Not only so, the promises of physical restoration to the land, they apply, not because of Israel's goodness, but because of God's grace. And I say Ezekiel 36 is one of those passages because what's promised there never happened with the return from the Babylonian captivity. It is still to happen. And with the Jewish people in the land, mercy will be poured out on them. And Zechariah tells us that all nations will come against the Jewish Jerusalem at the end of the age. So they have to be back in the land. If you don't see them as being restored to the land by God, then it is some form of replacement theology, even if you don't like the term. Well, what about Romans 9:6? Paul says not all Israel is Israel. He's not saying Gentiles have become Israel. In fact, Romans 11, he refers to them as Gentiles. He's saying within Israel, there is a remnant. There is an Israel within Israel. And then the rest of 9, 10, and 11, he talks about the nation as a whole. What about Galatians 6:16? Doesn't Paul refer to the church as Israel there? Look at what he writes to the Galatians, chapter 6, verse 16. Now, as many as live by this rule, shalom and mercy on them and on the Israel of God. Some translations say even on the Israel of God. But the most natural reading of the Greek is and. You'll find that in the great majority of translations and in the best commentaries, you'll see that supported widely as well. Look, why would Paul referred to the Galatians as the Israel of God, when the whole book he's telling them, you don't need to come under the law of Moses. You don't need to be circumcised. You don't need to become Jews. In fact, if you try to do that, then you make null and void the grace of God. You deny his grace by doing that. So, in short, what Paul is saying there is peace and mercy on all who follow this rule. Well, I've been teaching this letter. And we haven't thrown out the Jewish believers. We're not throwing them out. And on the Israel of God too. The Israel of God is the remnant, Jewish believers in Jesus the Messiah. Once again, the church has not replaced Israel. You want to get into it in depth and see the fruit of replacement theology in the past, read my book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood.